Kei tā wāhi nai, we're going to head overseas, and the West sanctions on Russia appear to be finally taking effect. This week, Russia announced gas flows through the Nord Stream pipeline to Europe will not be resuming as initially indicated, but instead will not be returning at all until economic sanctions are lifted. For perspective, Russia supplies nearly 40% of the EU's natural gas needs through this pipeline. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February and the implementation of Europe's first sanctions, Moscow held fast. The country's economy remained as strong as ever. But this energy standoff is telling a different story. So what does this mean for negotiations, and could it be the sign of the Kremlin's breaking point? Well, joining us now from Bratislava in Slovakia is Globsec's research fellow and defence and security expert Roger Hilton. Morning, Roger. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it. I want to start with that pipeline and Putin refusing to reopen it. Surely the West expected, or Europe expected, that this was the kind of thing that he would do, how ruthless he can be.
Well, to begin with, good morning, New Zealand, and good morning, Jenny. It's great to be here with you. From my perspective, when it comes to the pipeline, I think a lot of the EU member states expected this. There were obviously some who didn't think this was feasible, obviously with countries like Germany, but across the board, it's a bit dangerous to say, did the EU expect this? You had other, member states who are much more familiar with Russian tactics, like the Baltics or those in Poland, who already started to make changes even before the invasion by Russia into Ukraine. But in general, this standoff is not a good sign for the Kremlin, and I think long term, it's actually leaning towards the favor of the EU in terms of this energy standoff you mentioned.
You say that it's not a good sign for the Kremlin. Can we talk about Putin saying that he won't reopen that pipeline until those sanctions are dropped by the West? So in terms of not a good sign for the Kremlin, are you saying that economically this is having a huge strain on Russia?
Well, I take a much bigger perspective, Jenny, in terms of what this means. I mean, if you look at it, from 35,000 feet up, Vladimir Putin is fighting 3 wars at the same time. He's fighting the Ukrainian army, where he's getting decimated on the battlefield. He's fighting the EU and the West when it comes to sanctions. And now he's also fighting his own people to a certain degree, or having to starve off this desperation that's happening. So the idea that Putin and his administration want to potentially even open up negotiations is the clearest sign that the sanctions are working, and that even slowly that he's starting to buckle under the pressure, as the economy, despite managing through the first 6 months, is really, really in a bad state and does not have the dynamism long-term to continue as more sanctions come into effect.
Roger, I'm just wondering if you can expand a little bit on what is actually happening in Russia in terms of its citizens pushing back at Putin, because the only thing that we hear coming out of there, right, is that everything is fine. So obviously everything isn't fine. Are you able to expand a little bit more on what is actually going on in Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to talk directly to the viewers in New Zealand watching this morning, and any sort of statistics that you have coming out of Russia, I mean, you have to take them with a grain of salt. Yeah. In general, cherry picking all of the statistics. But the way to look at the economy right now is it is nationwide. It's not just the military industrial complex that's suffering, but there are basic things, across a society, whether it's a lack of commodities in the supermarket, basic things like cars being made now, Lada, that miss anti-lock brakes, that are missing airbags, that are discontinuing. Across the country, there are wage protests going on as well. And while these aren't getting the recognitions you have, what everybody needs to really realize is that if you have pockets in central Russia who are protesting, that is the biggest fear for Vladimir Putin. And it's not sort of the liberal metropolitan elite from St. Petersburg and Moscow. And that's really something that grabs his attention.
Okay, so given what is happening and the pressure that Putin is under, do you see him conceding in any shape or form at all and entering into negotiations with Ukraine?
I don't necessarily see, Jenny, any reason. I mean, it takes two to tango, right? I mean, who does Vladimir Putin want to negotiate with? He has to negotiate with Kiev. And right now, President Zelensky has made his position crystal clear from the beginning that no negotiations will happen until all the Russian soldiers have left occupied territories, including Crimea. And if you look at the landscape right now, the wind is at President Zelensky's back, with a massive success on the battlefield, with new weapons coming in and sanctions Biden. I don't really see any reason why President Zelensky would want to engage in sanctions. And at the same time, entering into negotiations with Russia is also a very dangerous game or crapshoot that you want to go with. Because what they could potentially do is freeze the conflict as they've done in Georgia as well as Moldova, try to reconstitute their army and then go back on the offensive. So again, the idea that, you know, Dmitry Peskov, the speaker for the Kremlin, is even sort of signaling that this might be on the table right now really shows weakness and a sign of desperation.
Roger, can we step out of Russia and Ukraine and look to the West and look at the sanctions that have been put in place? Are they enough, or should we be doing more?
Well, I think we have to put it in context again. What is the end policy game, or what is, as they say in the military, what is the end state? So if the end state of the EU and of the United States and Canada and countries like Australia and New Zealand is the total victory of Ukraine over Russia, the sanctions have to go in concert with the continuation flow of heavy weapons. The sanctions are just one part that will advance their policy goals, but the sanctions alone without heavy weapons are not sufficient to deter the Kremlin from continuing. And at the moment, they can, while they still might not be able to lose outright, they can still cause damage. Just recently after the massive win in Kharkiv, they spent a lot of unnecessary ammunition, taking whole towns into blackouts. And then they also have this idea of, nuclear blackmail with how they're holding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear reactor. So I think if the desired outcome of the West is for Ukraine to win completely, sanctions has to be one component of a greater strategy that emphasizes more heavy weapons coming into Ukraine so that they can finish the job.
Roger, I have 10 seconds left. Do you see this ending anytime soon?
No, I don't. Everything leads it to believe this could be a Korea situation from 1950 to 1953. But in general, the more weapons that come into Ukraine, they have shown a quick proficiency to use these advanced weapons. And with these weapons, the strategy of the general staff, they could clear out the Russians sooner than we all expected after February 24th.
Roger, you've been absolutely brilliant this morning. I cannot thank you enough for your time here on Breakfast. Roger Hilton, GlobeSec Research Fellow, Defence and Security Expert. Thank you so much.